The desert night was not usually so loud. Out beyond the sandstone cliffs and the mesquite trees, silence was the normal companion. Coyotes yipped from a distance now and then, and the whisper of the wind sometimes carried through the canyons. Like a ghost's lament, but most nights were steady, predictable, calm. Tonight, however, was different. Thunder cracked across the wide sky, rolling low and mean as if the heavens themselves had awakened angry. A storm was gathering, one of those rare, violent bursts that swept over the desert with little warning, pulling sand up into the air and rattling even the stoutest of doors. The old cabin on the edge of the wash trembled as the wind slammed against it. Inside, Tala sat at his small table, whittling a piece of mesquite wood by the light of an oil lamp. His hands, broad and scarred, worked without thought, shaping the wood into something useful. He liked the rhythm of the blade against the grain. It kept his mind still. For years, this was how he lived, quiet, apart, finding peace in the work of his hands and the breath of the land. Then came the knock. At first, Tala thought it was the storm, something blown loose, a branch snapping against the cabin. He ignored. It kept carving. But then it came again. Sharper this time. Urgent. Thud, thud, thud. The blade slipped in his hand. He looked up, frowning. Nobody came to his door. Not anymore. Setting down the wood, Tala rose slowly, his body stiff from years of solitude. The knocking continued, frantic now, accompanied by a high, thin voice almost swallowed by the wind. Please, please, somebody. He strode to the door, hand on the latch, and hesitated. Memories stirred voices of his own long-gone faces. He couldn't bring back. For a moment, he considered not opening it. Solitude was safe. Solitude didn't bring pain. But the voice came again, trembling and desperate. Please save my mama. The words pierced him like an arrow. His chest tightened, and before he knew it, Tala swung the door wide. There, in the dim glow of his lantern light, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. Her hair, dark as midnight, clung to her wet cheeks where tears had cut clean lines through the dust. In her small arms she clutched a ragged doll, the fabric torn and stained from the road. Her eyes wide, pleading, glistening with both fear and hope locked onto his, as though he were the only chance she had left in this world. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm howled around them, sending sand whipping through the open doorway. But all Tala saw was the child. Please, she said again, her voice breaking on the word. My mama fell. She won't wake up. Her small shoulders shook with the effort of holding back sobs, but she stood firm, as if refusing to let herself crumble until someone heard her. She lifted one thin arm and pointed back into the night, toward the black stretch of desert. Tala's throat tightened. He had seen children cry before, but there was something different about this little girl. Something that clawed at the loneliness he had built around himself for so many years. What is your name, little one? He asked, his deep voice rough. With disuse. Rosa, she whispered, clutching her doll tighter. Please, sir, my mama needs help. The words carried more weight than thunder, more power than the storm. Tala stood there, the old ache of his past stirring again. He had promised himself once that he would never let anyone back into his heart. Yet, as he looked at the small figure before him, soaked in dust and tears, that promise felt like a brittle. Wall already beginning to crack. With a slow, steady breath, Tala bent down and extended his hand. Come, he said, show me where she is. And in that single moment on a stormy desert night, before he even stepped out into the darkness, Tala opened not only his door, but the first corner of his guarded heart. The desert air hit Tala's face like a slap as he stepped outside, Rosa's small hand gripping his fingers with surprising strength. The storm was gathering its full fury now. the wind hurling sand in whirls that bit against their skin and made the landscape seem to shift. Like a living thing. The girl kept her eyes fixed on the ground, guiding him with quick, desperate steps. "Tell me," Tala said, raising his voice against the wind, "what happened to your mother?" Rosa's lips trembled. She was breathing hard, but she didn't. "Slow. We were walking. She told me we had to keep moving. She said we'd find a town. But then she got dizzy, and she fell. I tried to wake her, but she wouldn't open her eyes." Her words came in bursts, each one laden with fear. Tala could hear the edge of exhaustion in her voice, the kind that didn't belong to a child so young. She had likely been holding on to courage far longer than she should have. "Where did you come from?" Tala asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. Mama just said we had to go." Tala studied her from the corner of his eye as they pushed forward. Her little body was thin beneath her tattered dress. Her shoes, scuffed and torn, looked like they had been walked in for days without rest. And yet, despite her trembling, Rosa's grip on him never loosened. She carried herself like a child forced to grow too quickly, driven by the raw, desperate need to protect the only person who mattered to her. They climbed over a small rise, the wind tearing at their clothes. And then Tala saw her. At the base of a boulder lay a woman, her figure half covered by drifting sand. Her dark hair spilled across the ground, her face pale in the flickering light of the storm. She wasn't moving. For a brief, sick moment, Tala thought he was too late. Rosa let out a cry and dropped his hand. Running to the woman's side, she knelt beside her, pressing tiny hands against her mother's face. "Mama, Mama, please wake up." Her voice cracked on the word. She shook her gently, as if afraid that too much force would shatter her. Tala crouched down beside them. He placed a hand against the woman's neck, searching. Relief eased through him when he found the faint but steady beat of a pulse. "Weak, but there. She lives," he said. Rosa gasped and looked at him, her eyes filling with fragile hope. "Can you save her?" The question struck him deeper than she could ever know. Once, long ago, he had failed to save those he loved. He had carried that weight into solitude, away from the world. But now this small girl was asking him, not as a warrior, not as a healer, but as the only human being who stood between her mother and the end. He studied the woman again. Her breathing was shallow, her lips dry and cracked. Her body trembled faintly with fever. She needed shelter, warmth, water, and care, none of which she would find out here on the cold desert floor. "Yes," Tala said finally, his voice steady. "But not here. We must take her back." Before Rosa could answer, Tala slid his arms under the woman and lifted her with practiced ease. She was lighter than he expected, too light, as though hardship had already stripped her strength long before this collapse. Rosa rose quickly, clutching her doll to her chest, and fell in step beside him as he turned back toward the cabin. The storm fought them with every step. Sand stung Tala's eyes, the weight of the woman slowing his progress, but the girl's quiet determination kept him moving. Each time he glanced down, Rosa was there, trudging forward, her doll pressed tight under one arm and her free hand brushing against his leg, as though reminding him she trusted him fully now. When at last the cabin shape appeared through the shifting curtain of dust, Rosa let out a small cry of relief. Tala's own heart eased too, though he didn't show it. He had lived for years believing no one would ever need him again. But tonight, a little girl had pounded on his door, pulled him into the storm, and given him something he thought he had lost forever. Purpose. They reached the porch, the storm screaming at their backs. Tala kicked the door open, stepped inside, and laid the woman gently on his bed. The cabin smelled of smoke and cedar, the fire in the hearth still glowing faintly. Rosa climbed up beside her mother, tears streaking her dusty face. "She's going to be okay, isn't she?" Tala met the child's gaze. He could not promise more than the truth. "She has a chance," he said, "and I will do all I can." The little girl nodded as if that was enough. She leaned against her mother's arm, whispering words Tala could not hear. And in that moment, with storm and silence pressing at the walls, Tala realized his life had just shifted course. The cabin was dim, the flickering firelight casting shadows across the wooden walls as if spirits had joined them in the small space. Tala laid Maria Rosa's mother carefully onto the bed, the only one in the cabin, its blankets rough but clean. He adjusted her so her head rested comfortably against the folded quilt. Her breathing was shallow, raspy, each inhale a struggle. Rosa scrambled onto the bed beside her mother, tiny fingers pressing at the woman's hand as if willing warmth back into it. "Mama? Can you hear me?" "We found help," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her determination was strong. Tala crouched near the hearth, his mind already working. He had not practiced the healer's craft in years, but the lessons of his grandmother had never left him. Old knowledge lived in his bones, which plants soothed fever, which roots strengthened the weak, which prayers called for protection. He stirred the fire back to life, feeding it split mesquite wood until the flames licked higher and the cabin began to warm. Then he filled his pot with water from the clay jar in the corner and set it to heat. As the pot rattled faintly over the flames, Tala moved to a wooden chest and opened it. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, carefully tied with twine sage, chamomile, yarrow, and others that most had forgotten. Rosa's eyes followed his every movement. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "I will make medicine," Tala said, his voice steady. "It will help your mama." The girl nodded and hugged her doll tighter, as though that small cloth figure could give her strength. She did not question him. In her eyes, Tala was no longer a stranger, he was the only hope she had. When the water was ready, Tala dropped herbs into it, their earthy scent filling the room. He muttered quiet words in Apache, an old prayer for healing. His grandmother had always said the herbs carried the body, but the prayer carried the spirit. He dampened a cloth in the hot infusion, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against Maria's forehead. She stirred faintly, her lips parting, but her eyes did not yet open. Tala gave her a small sip of the cooled tea, careful not to let her choke. She swallowed weakly, then fell still again. Rosa's lower lip trembled as she leaned close. "Why? Won't she wake up?" Tala looked at the girl, seeing the fear she was too brave to release. He placed a hand on her small shoulder. "She is very tired. Her body is fighting, but she is alive, little one. That is what matters now." Rosa nodded, biting back her tears. She leaned her head against her mother's arm and whispered again, "Don't leave me, Mama. Please don't leave me." Tala felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He had once whispered them too, long ago, when sickness had come for his own family. No one had answered then. That silence had driven him into these lonely years. But tonight, he would not let silence win. Through the long hours, Tala tended to Maria, cooling her skin, giving her small sips of tea, and keeping the fire strong against the storm outside. Each time the wind screamed against the walls, the girl stirred but never left her mother's side. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her, and she fell asleep curled against Maria. Still clutching her doll, Tala watched them both from his chair by the fire. His hands, rough with years of carving and labor, now worked with a gentleness he had not known he still carried. It stirred something he had thought long buried in ache, yes, but also a strange warmth. The storm outside began to ease, the thunder rolling farther away. In the softer quiet that followed, Tala whispered another prayer into the night. This time, not just for Maria's healing, but for Rosa too, the little warrior who had braved the desert storm to knock on his door as dawns. First light seeped faintly through the cracks in the shutter. Maria stirred again. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a fleeting moment her gaze opened. She looked weakly around the cabin before her eyes found her daughter. Her lips formed a faint, broken whisper. "Rosa!" The girl stirred awake at the sound, her head snapping. "Up, Mama!" she cried, tears springing fresh to her eyes. Tala's breath caught, though he did not show it. It was only a small step, a fragile flicker of life, but it was a victory. The rescue had begun. The desert storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the wind that still sighed against the cabin walls. Inside, the little home seemed to hold its breath. The fire in the hearth glowed steadily, filling the room with the smell of cedar and sage. Maria lay beneath the blankets, her breathing faint but steadier than before. Rosa sat close, never letting go of her mother's hand. Her doll lay in her lap, its head bent against her knee like another small companion keeping vigil. Tala moved quietly around the room, checking the pot, adjusting the blankets, making certain no draft slipped through the door. For years his cabin had been silent, a place built to keep the world at a distance. It had been enough until now. Now it held life, fragile and raw, but life all the same. Rosa finally broke the silence. Her small voice trembled, though she tried to make it sound strong. "Is she going to stay alive?" Tala crouched by the bed, studying Maria's face. The woman's skin still looked pale, her lips cracked, but her chest rose and fell in an even rhythm. He touched her forehead lightly, noting the fever had cooled a little. "She is stronger than she was," Tala said. "She will need time, rest, and care. But yes, she has a chance." The girl exhaled, as though she had been holding her breath for hours. She hugged her mother's arm and pressed her cheek against it. "Thank you," she whispered. Tala said nothing at first. Words felt heavy in his mouth, unused. Instead, he stood and poured warm water into a small cup, handing it to Rosa. "Drink," he told her. She blinked up at him, surprised as though she had forgotten she too was human and not just her mother's. Shadow. Her little hands took the cup, and she sipped carefully, her body trembling with weariness. When she finished, Tala gave her a small piece of flatbread from his cupboard. She nibbled at it in silence, her eyes still on her mother. "You are strong," Tala said after a while. Rosa glanced at him, unsure if it was praise or simply an observation. "I had to be," she murmured. "Mama said I had to take care of her if anything happened, so I tried." Her words struck deep. Tala knew too well what it meant for a child to carry burdens too heavy for small shoulders. He had been that child once, watching helplessly as sickness stole his family. The memory pressed against his ribs like an old scar, but instead of turning away, he studied Rosa more closely. She was thin, yes, and her face smudged with dust, but there was fire in her eyes, a fierce loyalty to her mother. Tala rose and moved about the cabin, pulling another quilt from the chest. He laid it over Rosa's shoulders. "Rest now." "I will." "Watch." For a moment she hesitated, reluctant to let go of her vigil. Then, with her doll tucked under her chin, she curled beside her mother and allowed her eyes to close. Within minutes, exhaustion carried her into sleep. Tala sat back in his chair, the firelight painting lines across his face. He watched the two figures on his bed, the mother fighting for breath, the child fighting for hope. The cabin had never looked so full. The hours stretched long, marked only by the crackle of fire and the sigh of wind outside. Each time Maria stirred faintly, Tala rose to check on her, offering water or pressing the damp cloth to her forehead. Each time Rosa whimpered in her sleep, clutching her doll tighter, he pulled the quilt more snug around her shoulders. As night deepened, Tala found himself whispering old words prayers he had not spoken in years. Words for strength, for healing, for courage. Not for himself, but for the strangers now under his roof. By dawn, The storm had broken completely, leaving the desert hushed and clean. The first rays of sunlight slid through the shutter cracks, touching Maria's face with soft gold. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the second time she opened her eyes. She turned her head, her gaze finding Rosa first. A faint, tired smile touched her lips. Then her eyes shifted, landing on Tala, who stood nearby. She studied him, confusion and gratitude mixing in her weak expression. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves stirring. Tala inclined his head, saying nothing. He had not saved anyone yet, but for the first time in many years, he felt the fragile beginning of something he thought had been taken from him forever. Connection. In that small cabin, with storm clouds breaking apart and strangers sleeping under his roof, Tala understood the truth. The shelter he had built to keep the world out had now opened to let it in, and the world, in the form of a little girl's plea and a mother's faint smile, had entered his life without asking permission. The desert sun rose slowly over the horizon, spilling a pale gold light into the cabin. Maria stirred beneath the quilts, her eyes fluttering half shut again. Her breaths came easier now, though weakness still clung to her body like a shadow. Rosa was awake before her, perched beside her mother, watching every movement with fierce attention. Tala had been awake most of the night. Sleep rarely came to him these days, but now it was impossible. There was too much to do, too much at stake. He had sat near the hearth, carving small slivers from a length of willow bark and grinding them into powder with a stone mortar. His grandmother had taught him that willow, steeped in water, could ease fever and pain. Rosa tilted her head curiously as he worked. "Is that medicine?" "Yes," Tala replied, his voice quiet but firm. For her, the girl hugged her doll closer. "Will it make Mama better?" Tala did not offer promises. He had learned long ago that words could fail as quickly as breath. Instead, he nodded once. "It will help." When the water boiled, he poured it over the powder, letting the tea steep until the air filled with its sharp, earthy scent. Carrying the cup carefully, he crouched beside Maria. She blinked at him, her lips cracked and dry, but her eyes clearer than the night before. "Drink," Tala said gently, holding the cup near her mouth. He slipped one strong hand behind her shoulders, lifting her just enough. With effort, she sipped, her throat working to swallow. After several small mouthfuls, she sagged back against the pillows, her eyes closing again. "Good," Tala murmured. He placed the cup aside. Rosa's eyes shone with cautious hope. She leaned over, pressing her tiny palm against her mother's cheek. "See, Mama? He's helping." Maria's lips curved faintly, though her voice was no more than a whisper. "Gracias, thank you." Tala inclined his head, feeling the weight of her gratitude. It pressed into him in ways he wasn't prepared for. He had given his hands to survival for so long, chopping wood, hunting game, carving tools, but now those same hands were being asked to heal. And strangely, they remembered how the day passed slowly. Tala prepared more infusions, this time, with yarrow and sage, herbs to strengthen the body and clear infection. He mashed dried berries into a paste for nourishment, feeding Maria what little she could take. Rosa stayed close, fetching water from the jar, holding cloths against her. Mother's forehead as Tala showed her. Her small hands trembled, but her determination never wavered. By evening, Maria's breathing had deepened into a steady rhythm. Her skin, though still pale, had regained a faint warmth. She slept peacefully, one arm curled protectively around her daughter. Exhaustion tugged at Rosa's small body, but she refused to close her eyes until Tala placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rest," he told her. "She will not be alone." The child hesitated, then nodded and curled up at the foot of the bed, her doll tucked under her chin. Soon, her steady breathing joined her mother's. Tala sat in the fire's glow, watching them both. His mind wandered to memories he usually kept locked away, his grandmother's voice chanting over a sickbed, his wife's gentle smile, the laughter of a child that had once filled his life. He had buried those memories beneath silence and solitude. Yet now, with these strangers in his home, they stirred again. He reached for the pouch of dried herbs, his fingers brushing over each bundle. He whispered prayers under his breath, not in desperation, but in reverence. Healing was not only in the hands, he knew, but also in the heart. Hours later, Maria stirred once more. Her eyes opened and found him across the room. Her gaze lingered, soft but searching. "You stayed," she whispered weakly. Tala met her eyes, his expression unreadable, though inside something shifted. "Yes," he said simply. She closed her eyes again, a faint sigh of relief escaping her lips as the firelight danced on the cabin walls. Tala realized that the act of healing was doing more than saving Maria. It was awakening something long dormant in himself. The hands that had once closed doors to the world were now open, steady, offering not only medicine but the quiet promise of protection. And though he told himself it was only duty, the warmth in his chest betrayed the truth. Each breath, Maria. Drew was stitching together pieces of his own spirit he thought were gone forever. The morning sun filtered gently through the cabin's shuttered windows, scattering warm patterns across the wooden floor. Outside, the desert lay quiet, washed clean from the storm. Inside, a soft rhythm held the room, Maria's even breathing, Rosa's occasional rustle of movement, and Tala's low steps as he moved about tending the fire. Maria stirred, blinking against the light. She tried to sit up but faltered, her strength still returning. Rosa, ever watchful, moved to steady her mother's arm. I think I can sit," Maria murmured, her voice still weak. Tala crouched beside her, offering a firm hand. "Take it slowly," he advised, "one step at a time." With careful effort, Maria rose, leaning against both Tala and Rosa. She breathed in the warm, herb-scented air, looking around the small cabin. Though the place was simple, the firelight and the well-kept blankets gave it a sense of safety. For the first time in days, she felt a fragile calm. Rosa clung to her mother's side. "You're awake," she said softly, a hint of wonder in her tone. Maria nodded, her lips quivering in a weak smile. "Yes, thanks to him," she said, turning her gaze toward Tala. I don't even know your name, but you saved us." Tala inclined his head, his deep-set eyes steady. "I am," called Tala. "Thank you, Tala," Maria whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. For a long moment, silence filled the cabin. Then Maria exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling as if releasing a weight she had carried alone for far too long. Her eyes grew distant, staring past the walls of the cabin, as though memories long buried were surfacing. "Where we came from," she began, her voice trembling. "It's not safe to talk about outside, but now," she looked at Tala, then at Rosa, "I will tell you, so you understand why I fled." Tala gestured for her to continue. Rosa leaned closer to hear every word, her small fingers clutching her doll tightly. "We had trouble," Maria said quietly. "At first it was small things. Threats, people who didn't like what I said, what I did to protect Rosa. Then it grew worse. One night, we were forced to leave our home. We walked for days across the desert, hoping to reach help. Somewhere safe. But the desert is long and merciless, and my strength, I lost it." Her words were faint, carried on a whisper, but each one etched itself into Tala's heart. He had lived in the desert for years, but hearing a story of human suffering so raw and immediate brought him sharply back to the fragility of life. Rosa's eyes widened, and she pressed her small hand to her mother's. "That's why we came." "To you," she said. "We didn't know anyone else." Maria nodded, tears pricking her eyes. Yes, I didn't know who else could help, and then I found you. She turned to Tala. You were our only hope. Tala felt a strange warmth in his chest. For years he had lived apart from the world, closing his heart to avoid loss. And yet, here they were, two fragile lives in need of care and protection, and somehow, in answering their plea, he felt something he had not allowed himself in decades: connection. He crouched closer, his voice calm and steady. You did what you had to do. Rosa brought me to you. Now you must rest and regain your strength. The desert will wait for neither danger nor kindness, but you have survived it so far. That shows strength. Maria's lips curved in a faint, grateful smile. Strength. Yes, I hope we have enough left. You do, Tala replied simply, and you are not alone anymore. Rosa rested her head on her mother's arm, her small body trembling with relief. The bond between the three of them, fragile, yet unspoken, had begun to settle in the cabin's quiet space. Tala stood, brushing his hands over his worn trousers. There is still much to do, he said, but for now you may rest. The desert will not harm you here. As the morning light brightened the cabin, Tala realized something he had not felt in years. Life had returned to his home, not in echoes or memories, but in the breathing, fragile, courageous forms of a mother and child. And with them, perhaps, his own heart had begun to awaken once again. Days passed slowly, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythms of the desert and the cabin. Tala had grown accustomed to the soft sounds of life returning around him, the small creak of the floorboards as Rosa moved, the gentle sigh of Maria's breathing as she rested, the crackle of the fire that marked the passage of each evening. Rosa awoke early each morning, her eyes bright with a determination that reminded Tala of the sun climbing over the horizon. She moved quickly, fetching water from the jar and carrying it carefully to her mother, brushing back her dark hair with small, precise hands. Tala watched her with a mixture of admiration and quiet concern. She had grown stronger since the first night, but there was still a fragility to her, a reminder of all she had endured. You must eat, Tala said one morning as he placed a small piece of flatbread in her tiny hands. And rest. Strength comes from both. Rosa nodded, taking a careful bite, her eyes never leaving her mother, who now sat propped against the pillows with more ease. Maria's face had regained some color, her lips no longer cracked, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. She smiled faintly at Tala, a gesture small but full of gratitude. Tala began teaching Rosa little tasks around the cabin. He showed her how to grind corn for bread, how to braid rope, and how to care for the small flock of chickens that pecked at the dirt near the cabin's edge. The girl was eager, absorbing each lesson quickly, her hands nimble despite their small size. You are learning fast, Tala said one afternoon as Rosa carefully fed the chickens. Soon you will be able to take care of them without my help. Rosa's face lit up with pride. I want to help Mama, she said firmly. I want to be strong like you. Tala looked at her, sensing a mixture of determination and innocence that reminded him painfully of the family he had lost long ago. Strength is not only in the hands, he told her. It is in the heart. Courage can be quiet, but it is no less powerful. Maria watched from her bed, her hand resting lightly on Rosa's shoulder. You've taught her well, she said softly to Tala. She listens, she learns, she has hope because of you. Tala inclined his head, feeling a strange warmth he hadn't allowed himself to recognize in years. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had transformed into something far more profound, a home. It was not just walls and fire, but a space where trust, care, and small acts of courage intertwined. Evenings were quieter, though still full of life. Rosa would curl up at her mother's feet with her doll, whispering stories or softly singing songs she had learned in passing. Tala often sat nearby, carving small figures or tools, listening without interruption. Occasionally, Maria would tell them bits of her past, stories of the places she and Rosa had fled, the dangers they had narrowly escaped, and the fleeting moments of beauty they had encountered along the way. In these moments, Tala found himself speaking more than he expected. He told Rosa about the desert, the stars that guided travelers, the plants that could heal or harm, and small lessons of survival. Slowly, without realizing it, he was weaving himself into the fabric of their lives. One evening, after the sun dipped below the cliffs, Rosa leaned against Tala, her small body warm from the day's labor. "Uncle Tala," she said quietly, "I like it here. With you, I feel safe." Tala's throat tightened, and for a moment he could not answer. He looked at her, then at Maria, and realized that he had opened more than just his cabin to these strangers. He had opened his heart. "You are safe," he said finally, his deep voice steady. "I will make certain of that." Rosa smiled, her small hand brushing his. In that simple gesture, Tala felt the weight of his solitude lift slightly. For the first time in years, he no longer walked alone. The cabin, the desert, and the quiet life he had known were still there, but now they were shared, and in sharing, he discovered something he had long thought impossible, that life, even after loss and isolation, could return quietly but insistently. Through the courage of a little girl and the strength of her mother, the desert had grown calm, its wind carrying only the faintest whisper of the storm that had passed days before. Yet the quiet was deceptive. Tala sensed it even before the shadows appeared on the ridge beyond the cabin. The desert was vast, and people traveled it rarely, but not all were harmless. It was Rosa who first noticed the movement. She had been gathering firewood near the edge of the wash when she froze, eyes wide. "Mama," she whispered, gripping Tala's arm. Tala followed her gaze. 3 figures were approaching, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sand. They moved with purpose, too deliberate to be travelers seeking shelter. Tala's jaw tightened. His instincts, honed over years alone in the desert, warned him immediately. These were not friendly visitors. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice low but firm. Rosa's small fingers clung to his arm as they hurried back to the cabin. Maria, now recovering, watched them from the doorway, confusion and fear etched across her face. "Who are they?" Maria asked, her voice weak but urgent. Tala did not answer. Instead, he closed the door behind them, bolting it and wedging a heavy chair against it for good measure. He surveyed his cabin, noting every vantage point, every tool that could serve as a weapon, every line of fire he could control. The strangers had not yet reached the cabin, but he had little doubt they were searching for Maria. "They're looking for us," he said finally, his eyes meeting hers. "We must be ready."
Rosa's hand found her mother's. "Why do they?"
"Want us?" she asked, her small voice quivering. Tala's face was grim. "Some people fear what they cannot control. Some wish to harm those who cannot fight back. We cannot reason with them. We can only protect ourselves." The sun rose higher, and the figures drew closer, their intentions clear. Tala moved quietly, preparing. He loaded his bow, checking the string and arrows with practiced precision. Every step he had taken alone in the desert, the hours tracking. Game, reading the land, knowing where to hide, had trained him for this moment. The first figure reached the tree line. Tala drew the bow, arrow poised. He did not panic. Years of isolation had taught him calm, even in the presence of danger. The intruder would not surprise him, not here, not now. A sudden shout came from outside. "Maria, come out." One of the men called, his voice harsh and commanding. The other 2 spread out, circling the cabin. looking for any sign of their target. Tala stepped to the side, disappearing into shadow. He whispered for Rosa and Maria to stay behind the bed, out of sight. The girl pressed close to her mother, trembling, yet following his instructions without hesitation. Minutes passed like hours. The men pounded on the door, threatening, shouting, demanding. Tala held his position, waiting for the perfect moment. When the first man's boot shifted over a stone outside, Tala released the arrow with precision. It struck near the man's shoulder, not to kill, but to warn and unbalance. Chaos erupted outside. He moved swiftly, silent as the desert wind, using shadows and terrain to his advantage. One by one, the men found themselves outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and ultimately fleeing into the desert, their shouts echoing and fading into the distance. Finally, silence returned. Tala exhaled slowly, his bow lowering. He turned back to the cabin. Rosa clung to her mother, her small face pale but relieved. Maria's weak arms wrapped around her daughter. "They won't come back," Tala said. "They might," Maria whispered. Tala nodded. "Then we will be ready. Together." In that moment, he realized something profound. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a fortress. But more importantly, his heart, once closed and wary, had opened fully. He would not let these people take what he now cared for most. Rosa leaned against his leg, her small hand brushing his. "Thank you," she whispered. Tala looked down at her, a faint smile breaking through his usually stoic face. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you for trusting me." The desert stretched wide and indifferent beyond the cabin walls, but inside the small family had become unbreakable. And Tala, the man who once lived alone, knew he would never again face life without them. The desert lay quiet beneath the midday sun, its heat shimmering across the sand like a living thing. Tala stood near the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon with careful attention. Weeks of routine had brought a fragile peace, but he knew that peace was always temporary. Danger, he had learned, traveled in silence, and now it had returned. From a distant ridge, Tala saw movement, 3 figures approaching, deliberate and determined. These were not travelers lost to the desert. These were the men who had been searching for Maria, who had threatened them before. He could sense it in their gait, in the way they moved with purpose. They would not leave until they had found what they sought. Inside, Maria and Rosa were safe for the moment, but he knew their time was limited. He glanced at his makeshift defenses, the door bolted, heavy furniture arranged to block entry, small traps set along the perimeter. Still, none of it mattered if he did not act. Tala's jaw tightened. He had lived his life avoiding attachments, avoiding risk, avoiding the pain of losing what he loved. But these 2 mother and daughter had found their way into his heart. He could not abandon them. He would not. He prepared his bow, checking each arrow, feeling the weight in his hands. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, and precise. Years alone in the desert had honed him, taught him patience, taught him how to observe, how to move silently, how to strike only when the moment was right. When the first figure reached the outer edge of the cabin's shadow, Tala released his arrow. It struck near the man's feet, a warning and distraction. The intruder cursed and leapt back, scanning the area. The other 2 followed, unaware of Tala's position, and he moved swiftly, silently, using the terrain to his advantage. One by one, he disoriented them, leading them away from the cabin, away from Maria and Rosa. A well-aimed shot here, a carefully timed diversion there, and the men were forced to retreat, their shouts echoing across the desert before fading into silence. By the time Tala returned to the cabin, the women had emerged from their hiding place. Rosa ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist, her small face full of trust and relief. Maria followed, leaning heavily on her daughter but steadying herself against Tala's shoulder. "They won't come back," Tala said, his voice calm but firm. Maria shook her head. "They might. They always might." Tala nodded, understanding the truth in her words. "Then we will be ready. Together. You are not alone anymore. I will not let anything happen to you." Rosa's small hand brushed his arm. "Thank you, Uncle Tala," she whispered. Tala knelt down, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "No," he said softly. "Thank you for trusting me, for letting me care for you both." He stood and looked out over the desert. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of sage and mesquite, but also the distant trace of danger. Yet he did not flinch. He knew now that protection was not just about weapons or traps, it was about presence, vigilance, and the willingness to face what others would not. In that moment, Tala made a quiet promise to himself. He would guard them, teach them, and nurture them as if they were his own family. The solitude he had cherished for so long was gone, replaced by a new purpose that filled the empty spaces in his heart. For the first time in years, Tala understood the weight and the strength of responsibility. He was no longer alone, and he would face whatever came next, not for himself, but for the little girl who had cried at his door, and the mother who had trusted him with her life. The desert stretched wide and indifferent around them, but within the walls of the cabin, a small family had taken root, bound not by blood, but by trust, courage, and the unyielding choice to protect one another. The desert had returned to its quiet rhythm, the wind gentle now, whispering through the mesquite and stirring the edges of the cabin. The storm that had once threatened to undo everything was long gone, leaving only the clean scent of rain on sand and the steady warmth of the sun creeping across the horizon. Inside the cabin, life moved at its own slow, steady pace. Maria sat, propped against the pillows, her strength gradually returning. Rosa played nearby, her small hands braiding lengths of rope that Tala had shown her. The doll she had clutched for so long perched beside her like a silent guardian. Tala watched them from the doorway, leaning against the frame. The familiar ache of solitude that had haunted him for years now replaced with something wholly different, a steady, living presence in his chest. He thought back to the night it all began, to the frantic knocking, to Rosa's small voice piercing the storm. "Please save my mama." How simple, how fragile, and yet how powerful those words had been. That plea had shattered the walls he had built around himself, walls he thought would never fall. And now they had crumbled completely. Rosa looked up from her braiding and smiled, seeing Tala in the doorway. "Uncle Tala," she called, her voice bright with childish excitement. "Come help me." He stepped into the cabin, setting aside the weight he had carried for so long. Together they finished the braid, then moved on to other small tasks, preparing water, arranging firewood, checking the small garden near the cabin. Each moment, mundane yet meaningful, reinforced the life that had entered his home. Maria watched them from the bed, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You've given us more than safety," she said quietly. "You've given us a home and hope." Tala felt a lump rise in his throat. Words were not easy for him, but he nodded, letting the silence carry the weight of his response. He realized now that home was not merely a place of walls and roof, it was where hearts opened, where care and trust were exchanged freely. As evening fell, the sky painted in hues of gold and crimson, Tala and Rosa stepped outside. The wind carried the faint scent of desert flowers, and for the first time in many years, Tala felt fully at peace. He watched Rosa run along the ridge, her laughter ringing clear, and saw Maria following slowly, regaining her strength with each step. He thought about the life he had once led solitary, cautious, close to the world, and how abruptly it had changed. He had opened his door that stormy night, expecting nothing, and yet he had been given everything: a family, trust, and the fragile, powerful joy of connection. Rosa ran back to him, her small hands gripping his. "Uncle Tala," she said, her voice earnest, "we're happy here." "Aren't we?" He knelt to meet her eyes, his own deep and steady. "Yes," he said simply, "we are." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the cabin glowed softly in the twilight. Tala looked around at the room, the blankets, the small pile of herbs, the quiet rhythm of life, and understood something he had long denied himself. The door he had opened that night had not just been to his home. It had been to his heart. He had once believed solitude was safety, that closing off the world would spare him pain. But now he knew the truth. The heart that opens, even to strangers, can heal not only those who knock, but the one who answers. Rosa leaned against his shoulder, her doll tucked under her arm. Maria placed a gentle hand on her daughter's back. Tala felt their trust, their hope, and their love, and in that moment, he knew he would never walk alone again. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the cabin, indifferent and vast, yet within its small walls, life had returned, vibrant and unwavering. Tala had learned that a single act of courage, a single act of compassion could transform everything. And so, beneath the stars that blinked softly over the desert, the little family settled into the warmth of the cabin. Their journey had been perilous, their hearts tested, but they had emerged together, stronger and bound by something deeper than blood trust, care, and the unbreakable courage to open one's heart. The door had opened. And so had Tala's heart.